Okay, so let's dive into some source material for you today. We're taking a look at something that seems to puzzle a lot of people in the West, particularly in America.
Yeah, it's this challenge of trying to really understand figures like Vladimir Putin. It crops up again and again.
It really does. And the source we're digging into today highlights how persistent this difficulty is, even at the highest levels.
hmm It uses that specific example, former President Trump reacting to recent attacks in Ukraine, saying something like Putin had gone absolutely crazy.
Something has happened to him, he's gone absolutely crazy.
You
Yeah. And our source kind of jumps on that, saying, look, this isn't the first time we've seen this sort of misjudgment, maybe.
Or perhaps a reluctance to see the pattern. The source brings up President George W. Bush, famously saying he saw a soul in Putin's eyes,
Right. Or President Clinton thinking he could just rely on Putin to stick to agreements.
which the source suggests might point to a degree of misreading. Or maybe it's just more convenient sometimes for policymakers to frame it that way.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The source argues it goes much deeper than just, political convenience.
Yeah, well, that's maybe part of it. The core idea here is that a huge chunk of this disconnect stems from really fundamental differences.
Differences in the American and the Russian psyches.
Exactly. Forged by vastly different histories, different experiences.
Okay. So our mission then in this deep dive for you is to pull out those core historical and cultural contrasts that the source lays out.
We want to understand these deep-seated differences to maybe shed some light on why applying a standard Western, especially American, framework might lead us so far off track when trying to make sense of Russia and its leaders.
Got it. Let's jump in. So how does this source characterize the American psyche? What's the sort of default setting it describes?
Well, it paints this picture of openness, cooperation, a general positivity.
Like a let's make a deal kind of attitude.
Yeah, phrases like business-focused, open-minded, good faith, let's make money approach. And the source says these are foundations of America's success, but actually pretty rare globally.
Okay, but then there's the flip side, right? The source points that out immediately.
It does. This approach, while it works well internally maybe, leads to this consistent struggle when dealing with cultures that just don't operate on that same wavelength.
And there's that anecdote it uses, which is quite striking.
Oh yeah, the one about the Russian relative looking at a school photo and asking, apparently with genuine confusion, why have you all got the idiotic American smile?
Right. It sounds harsh, but the source uses it to explain how that American friendliness, that openness,
Can be seen totally differently elsewhere, like as gullibility, maybe unseriousness, or even naivety, like you're easy to deceive.
and the source is careful to say it's not about Americans being stupid, it's more about an ingrained desire to believe in the good intentions of others.
Which makes it harder, perhaps, to recognize when those good intentions just aren't there.
And this is tied directly to American history, according to the source.
Deeply rooted. A nation built by, conquerors and immigrants, all driven by this optimism, this belief in progress, people who overcame huge challenges.
Think about that arc from the Great Depression to being a superpower or bouncing back from Pearl Harbor to global dominance.
Exactly. The underlying ethos is sort of anything is possible. Problems aren't walls, they're challenges to be solved. The future is bright.
Okay, but here's where the source makes a really sharp contrast. It argues Americans lack something crucial that shapes many other nations.
Yeah, this idea of a genetic memory almost, of certain kinds of historical trauma.
Things like being invaded repeatedly.
Right. Or being oppressed by foreign conquerors, mass persecution by your own government, living under totalitarianism, experiencing widespread famine, or just outright national failure and collapse. Things that haven't really happened on U.S. soil in the same way.
Which sets up the contrast perfectly for the Russian experience as the source presents it.
A totally different picture. Centuries shaped by pain, poverty, famine, war, intense brutality, suspicion, national humiliation. It all combines to create a profoundly different worldview.
So one of the earliest formative experiences it talks about is the Tatar-Mongol yoke.
Yeah, this period of foreign occupation lasting roughly 240 years. Think about that time frame.
That's incredible.
It is. And the source uses these really visceral analogies, like comparing the invaders to ISIS or Khal Drogo from Game of Thrones, just to convey the sheer brutality involved. Butchery, rape, torture, forcing complete submission.
And the name itself, the yoke, like for oxen.
Exactly. It symbolizes that subjugation, being forced to pull this heavy load. The source even notes the lasting linguistic impact. Russian words for things like taxes, weapons, violence still have Mongolian roots.
240 years. That's as long as the entire history of the United States. It's hard to even fathom.
It really is. And then the source points to Smuda, the times of trouble.
What was that?
A terrifying 15-year period of absolute chaos after Ivan the Terrible's heir to year died. You had usurpers grabbing power, foreign invasions from Poland and Sweden, widespread famine, disease.
Just complete breakdown.
Total breakdown. The source says maybe a third of the population died, just wiped out.
And the lesson drawn from that.
According to the source, the absolute core takeaway for Russians from Smuda was crystal clear. A ruler must be strong, even fearsome. Because weakness inevitably leads to chaos, to Smuda, which is the ultimate existential threat that must be avoided at all costs.
That puts the whole Ivan the Terrible name in a different light. The source mentions it's a mistranslation.
Yeah, apparently the Russian moniker, Grozny, is closer to fearsome or formidable, which the source argues perfectly captures the kind of strong, even intimidating leadership seen as necessary to prevent another Smuda. Not necessarily terrible in the moral sense, but powerful enough to impose order.
Okay, so you have the Mongol yoke, you have the Smuta. What else?
Well, then there are the repeated invasions from the West. The source lists them off. Swedes, Lithuanians, Poles, Finns, and then the big ones, Napoleon and Hitler.
Even when Russia ultimately repelled them, the source says these left incredibly deep scars.
Absolutely. It contrasts the reaction after defeating Napoleon, where Moscow itself was burned, so not exactly pure triumph, with the celebration of victory in World War II, the Great Patriotic War.
But even that victory came at an unimaginable cost.
Staggering. The source cites estimates around 20 million Russian lives lost. Compare that to about 400,000 U.S. lives in the same war. That sheer scale of sacrifice and suffering is just on a different level. Hard for many in the West to fully grasp,
Yeah, and then the revolutions themselves. The source contrasts those two.
Hugely different outcomes and contexts. The Russian Revolution didn't just overthrow a monarch, it sparked a devastating civil war, which led directly into a tyrannical, murderous communist regime. Decades of terror under Stalin, economic collapse.
Whereas the American Revolution was a fight for independence, and even the Civil War, as bloody as it was, is often framed, rightly or wrongly, as a necessary step towards unification and progress.
Right. So the source connects all this deep, often traumatic history directly to understanding Putin's generation, people born in the 1950s.
What was their formative experience?
They grew up in the shadow of World War II, with the recent memory and lingering fear of Stalin's purges and camps, then lived through economic stagnation.
And then in their prime, they witnessed the collapse of their country, the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Which the source argues created this profound sense of loss, of national humiliation, and a feeling of being exploited by the West during that vulnerable period in the 90s.
So the argument is these kinds of experiences produce people who just see the world through fundamentally different lenses.
Completely different. They are absolutely not the happy, smiling, positive go-getters, shaped by a history of mostly triumphant progress that the source associates with the American default.
Which brings us right back to that initial idea we mentioned, the theory that Putin has somehow suddenly gone crazy.
And the source is really blunt about this. It basically calls that idea itself crazy.
Why? Why push back so strongly?
Well, the source suggests it's, frankly, quite convenient. For a couple of reasons.
Okay, sick what?
First, it kind of lets everyone off the hook who previously insisted Putin was reasonable or pragmatic or someone you could do business with. Despite actions like, butchering civilians in Chechnya, allegations of stealing children, reports of torturing prisoners, things that were happening long before the recent escalation.
So saying he's gone crazy now avoids confronting that maybe he was always acting according to his own logic, which just wasn't understood or acknowledged.
Precisely. And second, the source argues it conveniently justifies past foreign policy decisions that basically amounted to turning a blind eye or perhaps wishful thinking about the nature of his regime.
So instead of a sudden change, the source points to consistency in his career.
Absolutely. It walks through his history. He was a career KGB officer, the successor organization to Cheka and the NKVD, Stalin's instruments of mass murder and repression.
And he joined long after Stalin's crimes were widely known.
Yes. That's a conscious choice. Then, he was never actually elected in a truly free and fair election. He was essentially handed the presidency in '99.
And has held onto power for, what, 26 years now?
Pretty much, effectively ending Russia's brief experiment with democracy after the Soviet collapse.
And the source points to the fate of his opponents.
Yeah, it's stark. Significant political opponents tend to end up dead or imprisoned or in exile. It lists names you'll recognize: Khodorkovsky, Nemtsov, Navalny, Kasparov. This isn't a new pattern that started in 2022.
The source also brings up Crimea in 2014.
Right, the initial denials about the little green men, the soldiers without insignia. Putin famously said, with what the source calls a cunning grin, that you could buy uniforms like that in any store.
And then later admitted they were Russian troops and gave them medals.
Exactly. It demonstrates a long-standing comfort with deception and manipulation to achieve goals.
And since the full-scale invasion began,
He's just continued consolidating power, cleaning house of critics from all sides: liberals, even hardline nationalists who became too vocal, like Gherkin, who's imprisoned, or Prigozhin, who met a rather explosive end.
so the source's conclusion on this point is pretty clear.
Unambiguous. Putin retains power precisely because he has always been prepared to lie, manipulate, and yes, kill to achieve his objectives. It's the worldview, the skill set that the KGB fostered. He hasn't suddenly changed. Perhaps the West is just seeing him more clearly now.
Okay. So if that's the view Putin as consistent, shaped by this deep history,
Yeah.
what does the source say about implications for, say, U.S. policy?
Well, it brings up George Kennan, the famous diplomat and historian.
The long telegram guy.
That's the one. Specifically, Kennan's idea that Russia, or the Soviet Union then, is often impervious to the logic of reason, but highly sensitive to the logic of force.
And the source thinks that still applies.
It seems to suggest that yes, and it hints that maybe, just maybe, some American policymakers are finally beginning to understand who they're dealing with. It points back to that Trump statement, not the crazy part, but the part where Trump said, Putin wants all of Ukraine.
Acknowledging the scale of his ambition.
Right. The source mentions the author had hoped someone like Trump, maybe being less conventional, might grasp the need for both a carrot and a stick in any negotiation.
Not just one or the other.
Exactly. And the source is pretty critical of past approaches, suggesting they failed predictably. Just dangling the carrot of ending the killing, as it puts it, wasn't enough.
It also had that sharp line about sending
An historically and geographically illiterate lawyer to be bamboozled for hours in the Kremlin. Yeah, pretty cutting. The point being, that approach was naive and doomed to fail against someone operating with Putin's background and objectives.
So what is needed then, according to the source, for any serious negotiation to even have a chance?
It comes back to Kennan's logic of force. There needs to be a credible threat, a significant stick. Not just more sanctions, but the real possibility of, quote, high-grade, extensive military aid to Ukraine.
Applying pressure through strength.
That's the idea, to make the cost of continuing the aggression intolerably high for Putin.
And without that credible threat.
The source concludes that Putin will just keep calling America's bluff, sensing weakness or a lack of resolve, and continue pursuing his goals.
Okay. So wrapping this deep dive up for you, the core argument from this source is pretty compelling. It's saying that trying to understand figures like Putin through a standard Western, especially American, lens, one shaped by very different historical experiences, is bound to lead to misinterpretations.
Yeah, understanding the huge historical and cultural gap, the different ways history has shaped national psychology, might be absolutely crucial. It's not about saying one is right and one is wrong, but about recognizing the profound difference in perspective.
And for you listening to this, maybe the key takeaway is just how vital it is to recognize these different historical narratives and traumas when trying to navigate a really complex global stage. It helps avoid those pitfalls of projecting our own assumptions onto others.
Definitely. And it leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder, doesn't it? Building on what the source laid out.
Which is?
Well, if history really does imprint so deeply on a nation's psyche, shaping its views on power, vulnerability, leadership, negotiation, how do you effectively interact when those fundamental historical memories, those core assumptions about how the world works, are so radically different?
Can that logic of reason based on cooperation, openness, finding mutual benefit
ever fully bridge the gap with the logic of force,
Yeah.
which seems born from centuries of trauma, invasion, and suspicion?
That's something to really think about as you watch events unfold, a challenging thought to end on.